speaking on the resurgence of classical liberalism. You've heard mention of the article in Fortune magazine, the leading business magazine in the United States, which is published by the Time Life organization, featuring the article on the new libertarians. And I think what we need to do is focus on the background, how in both America and in Europe there has been the development of a very large new libertarian movement. And to do that, we need to go back, first of all, for 1 minute to the 19th century, which was the heyday of the classical liberal movement. That is to say, when classical liberal political parties were dominant in England and America and played important roles in other European political systems. And in each case, the classical liberal movements developed internal crises and began to lose that political dominance, political popularity which they had. In the United States, that was due to the capture of the Democratic Party, which in the 19th century was the great laissez-faire party in the United States. The Democratic Party was captured by monetary cranks, people who believed in fiat money, and immediately lost the majority support that it had, which then joined the Republican Party, which previously had been very bad on monetary issues, but which was smart enough to take a more reasonable line on money and to win mass popular support. And it continued to be the dominant party, but was so dominant that it split and led to Wilson becoming president. Due to the reaction of the American public to the fact that Wilson, first of all, after promising not to enter World War I, led the country into the war, and then imposed all kinds of controls, including and especially prohibition, there was a big reaction, and the Republican Party regained its dominance until the 1929 Depression period. But not learning from Wilson's mistakes, the Republican Party became the main proponent of prohibition, and this is what gave Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 the biggest base of his support, people wanting to get rid of prohibition. He was elected and then imposed on them a whole range of New Deal measures. But the Republican Party suffered as a result of its association with prohibition and with trying to give special privileges to big business a major eclipse. And so it is not until 1937 that Roosevelt began to be strongly opposed in public opinion and a new force came about. And that was due to two things. When Roosevelt was reelected in 1936 and entered 1937, he found that despite all of the New Deal measures, all of the Keynesian measures, that the United States was suffering a new and actually deeper recession. The 1937 recession was extremely deep. And at the same time, he had tried to impose greater control over the government by demanding the right to appoint new Supreme Court justices, the so-called Supreme Court packing scheme. And this led, both in Congress and among the American public, a huge revolt in favor of keeping the court as a brake on big government. So he suffered a huge defeat at the hands of the Senate, and facing this huge crisis in the economy, he undertook to solve it by a new range of spending. And of course, Congress would not give new spending after the New Deal had already failed, so he had to come up with a new crisis, and this was the so-called international crisis, and especially his attacks on Japan, leading to hysteria and getting people to vote for building new battleships, because that would create wide unemployment. And so you have the beginning, starting in 1937, of what we call military Keynesianism, trying to keep pump priming the economy through this military means. And this led to a big revolt, and one of the consequences of this revolt in the United States was Walter Lippmann's book, The Good Society. And this had a great impact on Europeans, such as Hayek in London and Mises in Vienna, and they began organizing a colloquium around the theme of Lippmann's Good Society book. And all of the American and European classical liberals began to come together again after a long period when they felt very defeated. But this first big block against the socialist programs of the New Deal that occurred in 1937 and the realization of the attempt of the New Deal to try to escape it through military spending led them to come together to see that there was popular revulsion against that classical liberalism could have a popular base. And so the American classical liberals and the ones in Europe began to come together to see some possibility for the future. But World War II intervened. One result was a number of classical liberals came to America from Europe, such as Mises. Others took refuge in England. And so during the war, there was a great period of retreat, in a sense, return to isolation. In the United States, the classical liberals suffered a huge onslaught from the left, especially led by the Communist Party, and the result was a great setback, attempt to find some places of refuge from this huge left-wing onslaught associated with the Second World War and the alliance with the Soviet Union, which the classical liberals opposed. And so when the war ended, and even as the end of the war was approaching, we find a few people, in particular Hayek, recognizing, first of all, that this terrible situation of the constant onslaught of the left could not be permanent, and that it was necessary to begin to raise the flag of classical liberalism. He did this first in a lecture that he gave at King's College in Cambridge in spring of 1944, in which he proposed the establishment of a new international organization of classical liberals. He wanted to name it after the three classical liberals that he admired the most, the three historians, Lord Acton and Jakob Burckhardt and Alexis de Tocqueville. And he gave a very strong reason for that. He said, if you look at Europe today, this is at the end of World War II, he said, Europe is facing a huge crisis. There is very little left of a classical liberal tradition, very little left of a classical liberal mass movement. There are huge socialist movements and huge communist movements and remnants of pro-fascist groups. There's very little of the classical liberal movement. There's only one group that isn't committed to socialism, either in the form of fascism or social democracy or of communism itself, and that was the Catholic electorate in Europe. And he said there are two choices. Either the Catholics can be brought as a main component of a classical liberal movement, or they can be left to the confusion of the Christian Democrats, who are sort of old-line conservatives and mixing in a little social democracy, and will give the people very confused leadership. And he proposed that by showing that the classical liberal leaders such as Acton and de Tocqueville and Burckhardt were Catholics, that there could be a strong resurgence of what had existed in the 19th century, which was a Catholic liberal movement. And at the same time, he published The Road to Serfdom in order to try and influence, first of all, the English-speaking electorate and English-speaking intelligentsia as to the need for a strong contest with the developing socialist juggernaut. Now, when the book appeared in England and received a good reception, it was proposed that it be published in the United States. And as I mentioned earlier, the United States media, journalists, and publishers were very much under the thumb of the Stalinist leadership. And so, due to this communist domination of American media, there was no possibility of publishing The Road to Serfdom with any of the regular publishers. Happily, there was one little oasis that had maintained a strong opposition to the communist juggernaut because it looked back to an Aristotelian and Thomist tradition, namely the University of Chicago under Robert Hutchinson. And due to this Aristotelian attitude, they were open to publishing the Hayek book and later actually to hiring Hayek, bringing him to the University of Chicago. And so, through the intervention of Henry Simon, who was the leading disciple of Frank Knight, who was still teaching there, and the colleague of Aaron Director, who was Milton Friedman's brother-in-law, and later of Milton Friedman, who came there somewhat after this. As a result of that, a few thousand copies were run off by the University of Chicago Press, just as a sort of nice little gesture. To indicate how bad things were, Henry Simon was so depressed at the level of socialist domination of intellectual life, he felt that the laissez-faire potentials were so minimal that he committed suicide. And nevertheless, soon after the book was published, it became a bestseller. And why was that? Well, first of all, by luck, Henry Hazlitt, who was the financial editorial writer for the New York Times and had become a disciple of von Mises, did the book review in the Times book review section and was able to present it very strongly. And he had already reviewed Mises' bureaucracy and omnipotent government in earlier issues and created a slight climate of opinion. The book began to sell, and the Reader's Digest decided to do a short version of The Road to Serfdom in one issue of Reader's Digest, taking up most of the issue. And so immediately, millions of people read The Road to Serfdom. In addition, the Reader's Digest put out a book in book form, that shorter version of The Road to Serfdom. More millions read it. As a result of that, people in the United States began to feel there was some hope to challenge what was going on. And that led to the establishment of the Foundation for Economic Education in 1946. The Foundation for Economic Education was set up by Leonard Read and F.A. Harper. Leonard Read had been the head of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. When he was first there at the beginning of the New Deal, he was a proponent of the New Deal, as was most of the Chamber of Commerce people. They were leaning towards the New Deal's proto-fascist direction, and he became an advocate of that. And he went to see Mr. Mullendorf, who was the president of Southern California Edison Company, who had been Herbert Hoover's personal secretary, and Mullendorf converted him to free market in 1 hour's conversation, and he then became a leader of this free market movement at the lowest point of the free market. And he stood with the free market philosophy, became an important advocate because he understood that the only way of succeeding with the free market, and the only reason the free market had value, was because it came from a deeper philosophy of freedom, that the economic arguments were not sufficient, that what was more important were the ethical arguments, that what the classical liberal movement stands for is justice, not efficiency. We all like efficiency, but that's fine. No one dies for efficiency. People all die for justice. And the American classical liberal resurgence is due to this reliance on justice, on the argument of justice. Leonard Read himself derived a good deal of his point of view from American authors such as Emerson and David Thoreau. And as a result, he was able to make a very convincing presentation. And he was joined by F.A. Harper, who had been an economics professor at Cornell University. And together, they drew together a staff, mainly of former students of F.A. Harper, who became the economics staff at the university, at the Foundation for Economic Education. And one of the first things they did was to follow up on something that had just been done, which was R.C. Hoyles, the publisher of the Santa Ana Register outside of Los Angeles, had published 3 volumes of Bastiat's writings. Frederick Bastiat, the great French mid-19th century advocate of free trade. And this began to have a great deal of influence, and so Fee then began to publish Bastiat's The Law in its own edition of less than 100 pages. And that one book, following on top of The Road to Serfdom, led to the current free market revival in the United States. Something like 1 million copies have been in print of The Law. It's probably the book that has had the most influence on President Reagan. And since no one else in Washington probably has read it, it may explain why Reagan and the rest of Washington don't speak the same language, because Bastiat's The Law is a principled defense of justice and private property. It very clearly identifies that the role of government is an unnatural role, a role that is contrary to justice, and that there's a conflict between law and legislation along the lines later developed by Bruno Leone and then by F.A. Hayek. And at the same time, the William Volcker Fund began to, a tax-exempt endowed foundation, began to bring Hayek over to America. Finally, it established a chair for Hayek at the University of Chicago and a chair for Mises at NYU. Neither NYU or the University of Chicago ever paid a salary to Mises or Hayek. These were done as a result of private funding. But nevertheless, because of this activity of the Volcker Fund, the work of general education done by the Foundation for Economic Education began to be done on a much wider level. Now, if we look at Fee's early career, one finds the publication of a book by 2 very young economists that no one had ever heard of, called roofs or ceilings. At that time, the United States had the benefit of rent controls. And these two economists said, well, you have a choice. You can have roofs over your heads, or you can have ceilings on prices. But if you have ceilings on prices, you're not going to have roofs over your head. And it was a very convincing essay published by the foundation. It was written by two young people named Milton Friedman and George Stiegler. In fact, when George Stiegler mentioned this particular book in his class at Columbia University, a younger than he graduate student came up to him and said, well, who published that book? I'd like to know more about it. And he said, well, the Foundation for Economic Education. And that's how Murray Rothbard was able to become part of this classical liberal movement. So you can see that this began to develop very slowly. Hayek, in 1947, was able to implement what he had proposed at Cambridge University during the war, an international meeting of free market people. And that was held at the Swiss resort of Mount Peleron. And there was something 40-some-odd members in attendance. And these included Mises and Hayek. It included Leonard Read and F.A. Harper from FEE. It included Frank Knight, George Stiegler, Milton Friedman, Felix Morley, Pierre Goodrich, Henry Hazlitt, John Davenport of Fortune magazine, and a large number of European free market people. And so they were able to meet and begin a process of intercommunication and comparison of different approaches to the restoration of a free market philosophy. Now, one thing that distinguished the United States situation from that of the European countries was that given the two-party system in the United States, there was no political party that had a classical liberal point of view. So none of the Americans were involved with political parties. The Europeans were involved with what were remnants of the classical liberal parties. One example would be the Free Democratic Party in Germany. The result of that was that coming away from the Mount Peleron meeting, there were several developments. One was that due to the hostility of especially the Americans who were anti-religious, Hayek's proposal to try to get a leadership role of European Catholics was rejected. The idea of naming it after Acton and Tocqueville was rejected, and the idea of reaching out to religious people by classical liberals was rejected, and instead something more neutral like the Mount Peleron Society name was chosen. Second, with the existence of these remnants of liberal parties and the association of these older European professors, for the most part, with these parties, they were tied into trying to maintain a political base, popular political base, by trying to compete with the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. And so they put forward what amounted to a much more lukewarm free market philosophy, epitomized by the so-called social market economy approach of the Germans, which is very confusing and very social democratic. And it's a kind of a platform that Ted Kennedy could easily run on. But not having that distraction in America, the Americans could pursue an educational campaign That is, to emphasize principles. And this Foundation for Economic Education did very, very well. It didn't try to deal with particular legislative issues. You'd need 10,000 economists working day and night to try to deal with every piece of legislation, because the legislators can come up with innumerable things. The bureaucrats come up with innumerable regulations. You can't defeat each one in turn. You don't have the time, the energy, the efficiency to do it. What they did was to attack ideas. So, for instance, they published a book called The Tariff Idea. The whole concept of tariffs, of government intervention in international trade, was wrong. That the Social Security idea, that was wrong. That the TVA idea, the government intervention in the electric and maintaining of rivers and things of that sort, was wrong. That each of there were major groups of government legislation, instead of trying to answer each one, to reach the principle, that the principle behind it was wrong, just as the principle really of any government regulation is wrong. And that's what they tried to show, and were very successful, to get people to see, not to worry about this year's piece of legislation in the House and this year's piece of legislation in the Senate, and whether it's 2% off here or 5% off there, because the percentages don't matter. It's the principle that matters. And if you can convince people of the principle, then they will see that government intervention in any area is wrong. And then you have an efficient result. In other words, it's very inefficient to convince a person that a particular piece of legislation is wrong. It's very efficient to convince them that the whole idea of legislation is wrong. Then they can be an effective spokesman for the free market. And so the Foundation for Economic Education has been extremely successful. Now, what is an example of that success? About 35 years ago, one of the members of the board of directors of the foundation, who was the vice president for the General Electric Company, chose a Hollywood actor to be hired by General Electric to be their educator, to speak to weekend after weekend to large groups of General Electric managers and salesmen and employees on the philosophy of freedom. General Electric, this vice president, was very concerned to educate at least his own employees with the free market philosophy. And so Ronald Reagan was educated. He was hired and educated by being given the fee materials, especially Bastiat's The Law. He began very clearly, he saw that the principle was what was at stake. That if you have the principle, then you can be very efficient and effective as a communicator of the free market philosophy. That there was no point in Ronald Reagan getting up 50 times a year to each weekend group and say, well, this week's bill before Congress that we need to oppose is such and such, and it's 5% wrong here and 2% there. Instead, he presented and learned himself how to communicate the total philosophy of freedom, and that it's a moral philosophy, not a mere question of efficiency. That it's a question of principle. And over the years, he's become, as we can see, an extremely effective communicator of those ideas. And as the Wall Street Journal pointed out about 2 weeks ago in a single editorial, very unusual for the Wall Street Journal, that this has led to a crisis of court and country. That you have the bureaucracy and the Congress, which represents the court, and you have, as they said, the peasants outside of the Capitol, whose only spokesman is Reagan, trying to challenge the court, to try and end the constant weight of taxation that's imposed by this bureaucracy. And the Wall Street Journal, among others, has become an effective voice in explaining this philosophy. Many of the journalists writing for them have been educated in these ideas originally put forward by the Foundation for Economic Education and then taken by other groups in turn. The reason that this has been effective is that along with the Foundation for Economic Education, the Volcker Fund and then its successor, the Institute for Humane Studies, and some other groups followed Hayek's prescription. Hayek, in a very, very important essay published in the journal at the University of Chicago, called the Intellectuals and Socialism. And he lays out how the socialists won, because they started out by gaining control at the highest scholarly level and were able to convince people that socialism was scientific, had the scholars behind it, and then the next level of academics and then the next level of journalists and editors, writers, public opinion makers fell into line, and gradually public opinion was formed. And that what was necessary, Hayek said, is for the classical liberals to win back dominance at the highest level of scholarship, to produce more and more free market advocates in scholarship. And then once they do that, other people will follow along. That will be so clearly dominant. Even if people don't fully understand it, they will appreciate the intellectual dominance that's achieved. And so over these years, the last 35 years, the emphasis was put on training more and more free market academics, especially economists, to present these ideas, and then to bring those ideas into other areas, to especially areas like law and economics, which the Volcker Fund began at the University of Chicago Law School, and in the areas of philosophy, political theory, and in sociology, psychology, other areas. And so that role has led to a major revolution, so that if you go back, let's say, to 1968 when Nixon was elected, there were a number of free market people available and who entered the government. But they were really not sufficiently large, and they hadn't matured enough in their careers to make an impact. And so the Nixon administration not only was a general failure, it really was the major cause of the current crisis, because Nixon opened the floodgates to everything that Johnson under the Great Society had begun. If Johnson did it, Nixon was going to do it better. Nixon was going to be the new Disraeli, the one who made the conservatives into socialists. And he was very successful, at least, in destroying the American economy, putting in wage and price controls, disrupting the whole energy industry. It just was an endless disaster. That has not occurred now because there were so many trained scholars available, first of all, to challenge what Nixon was doing. Who was it that challenged Nixon? It wasn't the socialists, it wasn't social democrats, it was the free market advocates who said this has nothing to do with us. This has nothing to do with the market. That Nixon is a traitor to these concepts. And therefore public opinion began to focus on these free market advocates, to see that they were independent of politics and of political parties. And then, having created public opinion, they were able, in large numbers, to fill important posts in the administration. Now, of course, they're totally frustrated by the fact that the Congress, due to the political party system and to gerrymandering, does not represent public opinion. And so you have this conflict where Reagan and the economists do represent public opinion. The president is the only one in the country, of course, elected on a nationwide franchise, and the congressmen are elected at a much more restricted districts. If you look, Reagan's free market philosophy's dominance is reflected partially by the fact that Republicans, for the first time, have maintained continuous control of the Senate, because the Senate, again, is elected by a broad franchise. But the individual congressmen are not, and they are a disaster, but they're able to block all the reforms put forward by Reagan and the free market people. So the result will probably be some form of crisis having to do with this, as public opinion begins to build up in opposition to what is going on in the Congress itself. Now, this growth of free market scholars began to have a big impact on Europe. Young European scholars began to see that it was that the Americans who were making new contributions were the free market people. The Keynesians and the socialists were sitting back on their old ideas, sitting very pretty, enjoying the fruits of dominating academia or holding key government positions. But the new work being done, whether it was in moral philosophy, legal theory, law and economics, economic theory, was all being done by people who were free market. And so Europeans who wanted to be involved in the creative, forward-looking part of their scholarly profession were looking to the American free market people. They were coming up with answers to the problems created by the Keynesians. And as the Nixon administration created a worldwide crisis through its inflationary activities, by its terrible depreciation of money, which alerted the American public to what the free markets people were saying, and which has made the money issue the central cutting edge of the questions being discussed in the United States and then in the world, because, as General de Gaulle pointed out already under Lyndon Johnson, the U.S. was exporting its inflation, paying for its inflation at the expense of the rest of the world. And when Johnson closed the door to the dollar at the Bank of France and insisted on gold in December 1967, he made one of the great, maybe the greatest contribution to the history of the 20th century. And the consequences of that in Europe, to see by de Gaulle's action that there was a crisis and that America's role of forcing the rest of the world to pay for its inflation was something that wasn't very wise from the point of view of the other countries. And so the critics in America of this gained a great deal of respect and recognition in Europe, and larger numbers of European scholars became first aware and then convinced of what these people were saying. And of course, especially through the Mount Pelerin Society and through the sister organization of Foundation for Economic Education and IHS in England, the Institute of Economic Affairs, through England, the rest of Europe became aware. The huge number of free market people that developed earlier in England than in the continent gave that a big push, and then we see how public opinion changed in England as a result of that, how the great issues that we think are important came on the agenda in the 1970s in England as a result of this much earlier work done by the Institute of Economic Affairs and they and their colleagues even earlier, before the organization was formally presented. And so we see now in all the European countries a catching up to what has occurred in America. And the result is a great deal of fruitful interchange, where the experiences in each country are able to be compared and to mutually educate each other as to not only tactics and strategies, but in terms of the newest developments in scholarship and research that can be useful in the presentation of these ideas. So we're today at a point where we've achieved a great deal of success at a first stage. And so we need to be very, very aware that we need to expand greatly the number of people who know what we're doing, communicate to them what we're doing, so that first of all they're aware of it, and second of all that they become convinced of it. And so we need, on the one hand, to pursue perhaps even more strongly cutting edge of scholarship, to follow Hayek's dictum of establishing first and foremost hegemony in scholarship. That hegemony in scholarship will lead to hegemony in public opinion. And then we have to learn how to apply strategy and tactics to communicating these ideas to a wider and wider number of people, especially at the university level, and then through them to the rest of society through journalism and media and similar areas. And today we have this great opportunity before us, and we need to be very aware of our responsibility to carry that through to its completion. Thank you very much.
Is this Reagan that you're talking about the same one I'm aware of? As I'm familiar with it, it seems that his Nixon administration is making conservatives into socialists. I don't know what Reagan's making out of it. He did indeed learn a lot of the rhetoric of the free market, which I believe is partly responsible for his great success in the polls. But his performance has been that of breaking promises and violating everything that he stood for in the campaign. Notably,
Could you detail some of the
he outlined the
promises that he didn't fulfill?
Eliminating the Department of
Louder.
Education.
Yes, eliminating the Department of
Department
Education.
of Energy.
Department
was
of
going to slash the subsidies and such things as agriculture, which he quintupled.
Right.
And he was going to balance the budget in '83. And he now has a larger budget deficit than all previous presidents combined. So this massive increase in budgets. I'm fearful that the work by the Foundation for Economic Education, if it was handing him a copy of the law, has actually maybe have done a disservice to the free market economy, because if by providing him with the rhetoric that it took to do the opposite, then I'm not accusing the...
No, but I would say, I would take a different position. I would say that, first of all, he's achieved a equilibrium in taxation, which has meant, from the point of view of the interventionists, a cut in taxation, which is the cause of the budget deficit. In other words, he's trying to cut spending. And the Congress doesn't want to cut spending due to the special interest groups. This is what the Wall Street Journal was referring to, that you have the mass of the people demanding drastic cuts in taxes and in spending. And the special interest tied to their congressional representatives resisting that. And so it's due to first of all, the rhetoric that the public has become aware and realizes they can do something. I mean, for years and years, decades and decades, people thought it was all hopeless. And all of a sudden they realized that everybody a majority in the country agrees with them, with the free market philosophy. So this has been a big step forward. There's a huge amount of confidence growing. And as they see that Reagan isn't going to be able to do something, they're going to demand rather radical reforms. And this is something we have to look forward to and have to be the proponents of. They need to have more people out there seriously proposing a radical change in the situation. No, but they gave a vote to the free market. I mean, if they had elected Mondale, what would have been the well, but that's a whole different problem. The Libertarian candidate or any candidate who is not yet established is useless to the mass of the voters. The mass of the voters can only choose between two choices, bad and worse. And so they chose bad over much worse. I mean, that's the most they can do. They can't do anything through Congress. In other words, what they know is the party system is useless. Reagan does not represent the Republicans because there aren't enough Republicans to elect anyone, which is why the Congress is in the state it's in. He is the representative of the independents who are a majority of the voters. So, but there is no party to represent the independents. They have to use the Republican Party, which not only has the rhetoric of Reagan, but puts in a large number of free market people in the government trying to do something. But the bureaucracy won't move. The bureaucracy is going to be there forever. I mean, what the public is beginning to realize is they have to bomb out electorally the bureaucracy. They have to abolish it. I mean, the failure of the Republicans to abolish the Energy and the Education Commission departments represents that. What was needed was the total elimination of whole departments. That's the present crisis between the Senate and the House. The Senate is saying, get rid of whole programs so that they never again become a burden on the taxpayer. And the Democrats are saying, oh, let's just cut this year and we'll save, and then it'll add up to something and we'll have a false balanced budget. So that's where the crisis is getting rid of whole programs. And there's a majority of the public who wants to get rid of whole programs, but they're only able to vote for the president and the Senate, but they can't, due to the party system, elect people on the lower level, and that's mainly due to the total failure of Republicans as a party. I mean, the Republican Party is a total disaster intellectually and in terms of administration and effectiveness. Due to that fact, huge numbers of people will never vote Republican on the lower level. They don't want people to vote for them anyway. The Republican Party is essentially an elite. I mean, the ordinary Republican activist is an elitist, and if he had a majority support, it would show him he's not an elitist. If he becomes a majority, then his whole psychology is in crisis. And so he can only be, his whole reason for existence can only be confirmed by constant losses at the polls. And the result is they achieve that. They're at least capable of achieving defeat. So that 3/4 of all elected officials in America are Democrats. The Republicans turn off everyone. And they certainly don't on any level except at the highest level present themselves as free market advocates. They all claim that they can do whatever the Democrats do, only with, with more panache or whatever that they can claim. Yes, ma'am.
When I had the great good fortune to sort of wangle my way into the Pelerin Society as a kind of junior supernumerary bookseller at Cambridge.
I saw you behind that mask in the back.
Yes. Well, I had to hide from yes. Sometimes. But I noticed that there were a great many people, and none of whom, unlike most of the people you've been talking about this evening, were within sight of the Atlantic Ocean. It was very interesting to see.
Say that again.
They were miles away from Europe or North America. I mean, there were lots of South Americans and Central Americans. There were lots of Asians, and I don't know if there are any Africans. There may be. But it's interesting how the free market idea is now going global.
Yes.
You mentioned you bumped into Venezuelan businessmen who were having their photographs taken with Hayek, this kind of thing. Which is good. I mean, that is inspiring and encouraging.
In Hong Kong, there were 300 Japanese businessmen having a picture taken with Hayek.
Well, they never do things on their own. And also things like the IEA, they're publishing books on global subjects like development economics, and also this book by Stephen Chung, I don't know if any of you know the name, the one, Will China Go Capitalist? It's a huge question, and I believe that that book's caused a tremendous stir in the Far East, far more than perhaps people in Europe and America realise. Can you tell us a little bit about the sort of global direction of these ideas and how you see that developing?
Well, on the one hand, obviously there's very strong roots for free market ideas in British Commonwealth countries, especially former dominions. So that in Australia, for some reason not very much in New Zealand, but in Canada and South Africa there is very strong free market traditions, and those have developed very well.
The libertarian movement in New Zealand is a personal friend of mine.
And then with the extremely strong and successful role of the IEA, that's also then had an influence on these other former Dominion areas, because both through contacts back and forth and that sort of thing. In terms of South America, what you find is a very high regard for the work of Mises and Hayek in some circles. Argentina, Venezuela, and Guatemala are the main areas. Mexico City has had a little bit, but not really very much. There is a growing classical liberal movement in Mexico centered on Monterrey, because there's a big difference between northern Mexico and southern Mexico, which isn't the result of proximity to the United States per se. It's a whole cultural thing. But in Monterrey, which is where the free market type industries have developed, in contrast to Mexico City, where it's the state industries, there's a very strong free market movement, but constantly being undermined by the government seizing the banks or destroying the monetary system and that sort of thing. But it's mainly in Guatemala, Venezuela, and Argentina, and that's due to very strong initial groups of people who just kept working at it and have made a great success, while in the other countries there are small groups, but they're not really able to do very much. And I think the reason in Argentina, Venezuela, and Guatemala that so much success was done was that they, first of all, were very impressed by Hayek and Mises and followed the Hayek prescription of trying to argue the case first at the highest level of scholarship. And finally, they have also followed the idea that the key issue is a question of justice, and they've been very motivated by the moral philosophy background to free market ideas, and so that has made a big impact. They're able to reach students to be very successful in educating, and that's been supplemented by the fact that there's a very strong Austrian economics group in Madrid that publishes in Spanish a lot of the key works in Austrian economics, and that is a way of reinforcing that whole thing. There was a question in the back. Yes, you had a...
No.
You're finished? Okay. Yes.
I'm not exactly sure whether your presentation of the reasons which led to the displacement of the socialist paradigm among the intelligentsia by the classical liberal paradigm, you seem to sort of look at it as a rational phenomenon, to be accounted by factors like the superiority of the latter in terms of logic and other factors, and I guess that is how you conclude appealing to that one should have to converse, to convince the intelligentsia to kind of debate on the most abstract level, etc. Now, however, if we look at the history of science, or rather the historiography of sciences, we see that, for example, the displacement of one paradigm by the other is a very irrational phenomenon, and it usually to be accounted by the sheer factor of boredom.
Sheer factor of
boredom. how much emphasis do you put on these things?
Well, there are a couple of points that you're making. One has to do with the question of paradigm shifts. And, well, that's a very, very important subject and really deserves, a whole conference to discuss all of that's involved. I certainly am impressed with the importance of the sociology of science in understanding change and development. I certainly do not see it as some sort of automatic progression of truth, and there's no reason at all why truth should prevail. I mean, the world is surrounded by 10,000 years of ignorance prevailing, and so it's only on rare occasions and for no good reason that truth occasionally prevails. So we have no historical record to support a sort of universal progress point of view. On the other hand, one might say that there's been a certain amount of success for good thinking, if not logical thinking, that has led in the last 200 years to a good deal of progress that's so immense that people are aware of the possibilities. And even though they've gotten confused in the process, they decided they were so well off, why not be egalitarian and share it with everyone? And then they find that that leads to the diminishing of wealth, not the creation of wealth, and it doesn't lead to egalitarianism in the ways that they thought, that they turn back to the path that has led to success, to recognizing the importance of property rights and a growth-oriented society. So on that level, I think that it's one of the areas that very minute amount of scholarship has been given compared to other areas. And so the science of strategy, in a sense, needs a huge amount of investment to help us understand where we're going and what's going on. And you find a good deal of, a good number of people don't want to do that. They view that as dangerous or constructivist or whatever the case might be, and so that there's a great deal of resistance to doing strategic analysis to find out how successes have occurred in the past and what are the needs for success in the present. Now, there was another part of that point that you made. Could you repeat that a second?
The idea was that perhaps we should start explaining certain changes by the factor of boredom.
Of boredom. Well, but I don't know. I don't think that's the case. I see a good deal of excitement. Being bored earlier by the welfare state and leading to, well, I mean, one possibility is that that free market philosophy, if constantly pushed, will be a constant source of excitement. It may not run out of steam in the way that the welfare state has run out of steam. Welfare state is aimed at an equilibrium society. The free market philosophy is, as Schumpeter said, destroys equilibrium. And so, to a certain degree, there's constant change and therefore possibility of constant excitement. It's aimed at constantly disrupting existing customs or forms in order to move forward and progress. And the socialist is very reactionary. He wants to maintain equilibrium. He wants to stop things in its track, which then leads to boredom. But it certainly should be the case that we should constantly emphasize the challenging and radical nature of what we're proposing so that especially youth can see that it's not something of the past but constantly something of the future.
Could I, to bring you back to sort of historical terms again, could you say a few words about the relationships and mutual influences of Ayn Rand, Rose Wilder Lane, Isabel Patterson in the pre-war period, that is, before sort of Ayn Rand disappeared up her own rear end of dogmatic sectarianism?
Well, all of these people were influential through their writings and through their conversation. At that point, the numbers of classical liberals was rather small, but did form a somewhat important group in New York. They formed a small group in New York, but New York being important, in other words, if you write a book review for the New York Times Book Review, it reaches 1 million key people, whereas if you write it for, I don't know, the Kansas City Star or the St. Louis Globe-Dispatch, it reaches 1 million people who don't have any influence. And so this is the reason, for instance, that the left has always been so successful, because being in New York, they have access where all the publishing and all the media and the radio and television and that sort of thing. And that's also why the neoconservatives are so successful. There are not many of them, but they are constantly having lunch or dinner with someone, and it's always someone very important because they're in New York, whereas if they had, went up to Cape Cod or something and lived off and wrote in isolation, they wouldn't see anyone, and every 5 years they'd publish a book or something like that. So being in New York was very valuable at that time. It gave they were able to have a lot of influence on some of the editors of the Reader's Digest, for example, and to have a certain impact through that medium. So a lot of their influence was their ideas expressed in these small groups, much more maybe than their books at that time, because they were reaching a lot of very equally intelligent people who then debated and discussed issues and formulated their ideas. And Isabel Patterson and Rose Wilder Lane and Ayn Rand tended to be more radical than the other people. And so they carried the debate in a more rigorous direction and kept coming up with new questions to be solved. And so in that sense, they kept disrupting the equilibrium. Everyone was satisfied perhaps that the free market worked or something, and they kept bringing up new challenges to it, so that it was that role that was so important in that formative period. But unfortunately, and maybe, it was just a question of becoming older and moving in different directions, and at the same time being set in their ways, that they no longer continued to have that impact. Probably a very important development was the emergence of the National Review group in 1955, because they brought in a lot of European social democrats and a lot of European conservatives who introduced these were the people that had sort of lost out in Europe and then became dominant for a long time in American right-wing ideology, and none of that led anywhere, but it was very disruptive and created lots of schisms, and the free market people were mainly excluded because they were said, and this may be an example of the boredom factor, that the free market people were boring or too extreme in the case of Ayn Rand. And so, for instance, there was the famous attack on Ayn Rand by Whittaker Chambers in National Review, to which Murray Rothbard wrote the major response. And so, on the one hand, they thought Mises and Hayek were boring, and Ayn Rand was too exciting, I suppose. So this was one of the problems, and so they thought they had a middle way of all sorts of exciting ideas from the 4th century or whatever it is that they were drawing them from, and the unfortunate libertarians were stuck with, the sort of big turn of the 20th century ideas, which were too boring to discuss. I think we need to end at this point. Thank you very much.